Okay. And we're going to be moving on to our next panel now. And what are the famous words from Rocky 2? Ding, ding. Out of the pool. So, okay, if the participants could please move to our new panel. It's going to be on crypto assets and new developments. Again, we're going to have all of our participants introduce themselves, and I'll be handing things over to Ross Leckow, who is the Deputy General Counsel of the Legal Department of the International Monetary Fund. This is FinTech Week, but the first 2 days are focusing on crypto assets, and it's hard for me to not state enough, really, the amount of work that Ross has been doing and working to coordinate with the International Monetary Fund, both for today and for tomorrow, to really ensure a global outlook, and they've been real partners in the process. So, Ross, thank you very much, and I'll hand the panel over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here to Georgetown FinTech Week and this panel on new developments in crypto assets. As Chris mentioned, I'm Ross Leckow. I'm Deputy General Counsel in the Legal Department of the IMF. It's also the pleasure for the IMF to co-host with Georgetown's Institute of International Economic Law today and tomorrow's sessions on FinTech. We'd like to thank everyone here at Georgetown, but particularly Professor Chris Brummer for making this event happen. I have to say that FinTech is a topic of growing importance to the IMF. Given our mandate to promote the stability and effective operation of the international monetary system and the global financial system underlying it, our interest in this area should be rather obvious. And this is also a subject of great attention amongst our 189 member countries across all regions and all levels of development, who are looking at the great potential, but also the risks associated with some FinTech applications. And it's for this reason that we now have a very active program of research and publication, outreach to the industry, and direct engagement with our member countries. And 3 weeks ago now, we, with our colleagues at the World Bank at our annual meetings in Bali, Indonesia, launched the Bali FinTech Agenda, which is really the first effort, I think, at least we think, to put together a comprehensive framework of issues that policymakers in countries need to think about when they're considering how to approach FinTech. And a particular focus of our work has actually been crypto assets. It's been a topic of discussion in our two first policy papers on FinTech, and also a number of blogs and speeches by our Managing Director, Christine Lagarde. We're focused on the potential that crypto assets have to make the global financial system more efficient and effective, but also the risks that they pose, particularly to financial integrity, money laundering and terrorist financing, and other types of financial crimes. Our panel today will focus on recent developments in crypto assets and the implications they hold for the financial system of the future. It goes without saying that things in this area are moving very, very quickly as the crypto asset market is growing and more crypto assets are being marketed and sold in the financial system. To discuss this question, or these questions, we have assembled, I think, a panel of very distinguished experts on crypto assets. And it's my pleasure to introduce them to you now. To my far right is Mr. Ryan Zagone, who is Director of Regulatory Relations at Ripple, a technology company that is enabling the next generation of global payments. To my immediate right is Desiree Dickerson from Lightning Labs. Desiree is head of operations there, and Lightning Labs is building an open protocol layer that leverages the power of blockchains and smart contracts to make cheap, fast, private transactions available around the world. To my immediate left is Josh Swihart from Zcash. And Josh is Vice President of Marketing and Business Development and is responsible for all commercial activities at Zcash. And to my far left is Peter van Valkenburg from Coin Center. Peter is Director of Research at Coin Center, which I think, as you all know, is a leading nonprofit research and advocacy group focused on the public policy issues around cryptocurrency. The format for our session today is designed to encourage an open and interactive discussion amongst the panelists and with the audience. I'm going to begin by asking the panelists, all of the panelists, a general question, which I think, given their involvement in different aspects of the crypto asset market, I suspect they may have different perspectives on. I'll then ask each of the panelists individual questions that are designed to encourage an interactive discussion before turning to the audience for questions. So let me start with a general question for each of the panelists. What major developments that have occurred over the last year in the crypto market have contributed to the further mainstreaming of crypto assets? What are the major challenges in the development and further adoption of crypto assets? And what do you think can be done to address those challenges? So perhaps I can start with Ryan.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and a special thanks to the IMF as they've continued to drive forth a conversation around crypto and fintech that we see as very balanced, looking at both addressing the risk that we see in the market, but also enabling and motivating innovation in this sector. We see a lot of potential for blockchain and crypto assets, particularly for financial inclusion and economic development. And we think that important balance between market safety and innovation is critical to achieve that. So thank you to Ross and the IMF. At Ripple, we're using blockchain and crypto to enable what we see as the next generation of cross-border payments. So we have two platforms, a blockchain and a crypto platform, that enable real-time cross-border payments. So this is a shift from payments that used to take 2 to 4 days to settle. We do it now within 2 to 4 seconds. One particular platform or solution we have that uses crypto is in a rather unique way. When we think about the early days of Bitcoin and crypto, it started as a replacement for fiat currency. We would use crypto instead of government currency. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is this shift, like a paradigm shift, in both the users, moving away from retail users to more institutional, which we heard about on the first panel, and in use cases, shifting away from replacing fiat currency to Ripple being a good example of using this technology to connect fiat currency more efficiently. So connecting the US dollar and hard-to-reach currencies, say the Thai baht, or rather like tier 2, tier 3 currencies that don't have high liquidity today. In the past, making these payments required pre-funding. You have to pre-fund capital in these foreign markets. That was the highest cost factor for a payment. That's why the cost of remittances haven't come down over many years. This capital cost, this pre-funding, is rather significant. So we've built a platform that uses crypto as a real-time bridge, connecting currencies more efficiently without having to pre-fund. And the critical piece here is that the crypto allows this real-time bridge for immediate access overseas. You don't have to lock up capital. And from our early pilots, we've seen that this solution reduces the cost of a payment by 40 to 70%, all from that capital savings. So we see this as a clear paradigm shift in payments from a pre-funded model to a real-time access and liquidity. We think that's a big shift in the market that's really come to fold over the last year. In 5 seconds, one important point to call out, and just to clear confusion that may have already started today. Ripple is a software company. Like, we develop software, we sell that to banks. We use crypto. The crypto, particularly XRP, one that we favor given its speed, efficiency, and low cost, is separate from our company and existed before our company started. There were early Bitcoin developers that splintered off and created XRP. We own a significant share of that, but we have a very small amount of control on that platform. We run 9 validators of the 150 that exist on that platform. So we have about 6% of the of the voting or validation power on that platform, making it very decentralized. It's independent from Ripple. It exists outside of us. It'll exist if we were to go away. That makes it very much akin to Ethereum and Bitcoin in that sense. Open source, decentralized, although more decentralized, and without a central party that controls it.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Maybe now I can turn to Desiree.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you also for having me. I think one of the major developments that we at Lightning Labs obviously have been working on and think we've made a lot of progress over the past year is with scalability. And that's really addressing the limits in the amount of transactions that the network can process. So, I mean, obviously right now, Bitcoin is kind of slow. There's fees associated with it. I think right now the transaction time is like 4 to 7 seconds, 4 to 7 transactions per second, whereas credit cards are obviously much faster, into the thousands of transactions per second. So we're getting there, and that's kind of what we're looking to solve. But even though it's still really early on in this process, people are actually working with the Lightning Network and are actually transacting on it. So we're seeing 2,000 purchases on BitRefill, which is for phone vouchers. There's over 4,000 merchants actually using Lightning payments on CoinGate, which is just a payment gateway. There's around 5,000 active nodes and almost 120 BTC channel capacity, which is around 770,000 US dollars. So I think 2018 was definitely a year of everyone kind of thinking about scalability. And it wasn't just on Bitcoin. I mean, there's, people are working on it on Ethereum and EOS, and I'm not as familiar with those. But I think scalability was really what I think there were a lot of developments in. But in terms of major challenges that you had asked, I think the big thing for us is really the usability piece. Looking forward next year, and we've started really addressing this with some of our products. Our desktop wallet, which is still on testnet, is just absolutely beautifully designed, very intuitive to use. And I don't think that we're seeing that in a lot of the products that around crypto assets. So I think that's something that needs to be pushed out in the next year, and that's kind of where we're looking forward. And I think that's going to be something that is one of the biggest challenges, that if we start addressing that, we'll see a lot more adoption.
Thanks very much. Josh.
Also, thank you for having me. One big change I've seen in the last year is the t-shirt to suit ratio at crypto conferences. I've never seen so many at a crypto conference.
So which way is it going?
Yeah, I don't think I've been in a room with so many suits in my life. But I'm not from DC, so I don't know. Certainly, we've seen a massive price decline over the course of last year, and that has coincided with a decrease in the volume of transactions. But the industry is moving at actually an incredible pace. If you kind of look away from just price, and actually what's happening with technology, with investment. So we're seeing a massive amount of inflow and investment in technology companies, and a lot of them spinning up. We saw just a couple weeks ago, Coinbase raised another $300 million. We're seeing incredible technical innovation that's happening where people are heads down doing work. So in the case of Zcash, we just recently released some of the most advanced, maybe the most advanced cryptography in the world, and we've operationalized it so that it's not theoretical, it's actually in the wild and working. These are amazing breakthroughs that don't necessarily hit the mainstream press because the price has been kind of going down over time. Although I think last month the crypto market was more stable than the S&P in terms of volatility. So we'll see. And we're also seeing the advent of other things like stable coins and things like that are pegged to the US dollar. I think in terms of challenges, everything is just so new, right? So in the early days of the internet, there were tools like Gopher and Usenet and things like that that people had to use in order to make use of that network. And it wasn't until the 90s that we had browsers that made usability really possible, as Desiree alluded to, as being a challenge. And so the Bitcoin white paper is only 10 years old. These technologies, like Zcash is now 2 years old. So it is very, very young. But it's not just the technology that's young. We're trying to still figure out what this thing called money is, and how it works, and how it can evolve. Because the early adopters of cryptocurrency were just speculators, and that's largely the traffic that's there today, right? It's speculative asset. But believe that as speculation increases and more liquidity comes into the market, which, by the way, some of the big players like Galaxy and Cumberland and folks like that are now launching crypto funds in trading desks all around the world. Cumberland just launched one in Singapore. Galaxy is launching one in Japan, and putting together significant financial infrastructure to allow us to build liquidity such that it can become a viable store of value, kind of the digital gold that we talk about. And I believe that once things kind of stabilize as it relates to that, along with usability, along with clarity around regulation, along with some other kind of technology advances like scale and security, that this has the potential to be a medium of exchange, and maybe eventually move to a unit of account. But I think we're just at the kind of the headwaters and just the beginnings of what's to come.
Thank you very much. Peter.
So when Ross and I were talking about what I could contribute to this discussion, we talked about how we have excellent panelists who are dealing with usability, who are dealing with scale, who are coming from companies working on privacy. To my mind, and I sort of gave it away in my comment on the last panel to Angela Walsh's very useful but provocative remarks, I wanted to focus on decentralization. What do we see developing in this technology with respect to shifting power and also minimizing power within these networks? What are the challenges ahead? So I have a short list. I'm going to gloss over these things real quickly, and feel free to either ask questions once we're there, or maybe it'll spur a debate. But a few things. Mining centralization for proof-of-work cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum today. One thing that's worth noting to a lot of people who aren't native to the technology, when we talk about a powerful miner, we're usually talking about a pool, which is a person who runs a server that a lot of other people connect to. And those other people, they might know that person, or they might not know that person. They might just connect to that server. And they donate their proofs of work to that person running that server and say, hey, I'm giving you some of the work that you'll use to mine the blocks on the network. I would mine myself, but I'm so small that if I just sent my computer mining for a long time, it would take me far too long to earn any real returns. So I'm going to give you, pool operator, my work. You'll combine it with work from people all over, and together we'll mine blocks more frequently than any of us would on our own, per se, and it'll smooth out the economic returns to this activity. So why is that worth noting? It's worth noting that when you see a headline that says such and such has 30% of the hash power on the Bitcoin network, you're usually talking about a pool operator. And that means that the people donating their work to that pool can leave. They can choose to withdraw their work from the pool operator if the pool operator seems to be behaving in a way that might be characterized as an attack on the network. Now, this is still a problem, though. And the real problem here is that the pool operator is the one who's deciding which transactions to put in the block that is constructed from the work of all the people who are providing proofs to the pool operator. So that gives them the power to refuse to put transactions in a block, and it potentially gives them the power even to put transactions in a block, move many transactions down a few blocks later if they have a dominant power on the network for that full amount of time, put a transaction that would seem irreconcilable with the other one that was previously publicly announced because they reorganized the chain. So that's too much power. We shouldn't have pool operators who are capable of choosing which transactions to put in the blocks that are constructed from the work of people who donate their power to that pool operator. What's a good solution for that? Well, there is an excellent solution that's being worked on by a number of Bitcoin Core developers and others, wherein if you're donating your work to a pool, if your work ends up being the work that cracks the block, you, the person submitting work to the pool, choose which transactions to put in, not the person who is operating the pool. So this, in a fundamental way, changes the assumptions of power within mining. And we can get into more detail about that. Hopefully that made some sense to you. Now people contributing their small amounts of work to the pool get to choose which transactions to put in, not the pool operator with an amalgamation of all the work that they're being given. Obviously this is a very complicated issue, but this I think underscores the fact that decentralization is a word that's too often used as a way to just gloss over these highly technical details. But there are real technical details, some of which are actually fundamental to improving how we minimize power and trust in these networks. Another one. Bitcoin is proof of work. Ethereum today is proof of work, GPU-based as opposed to ASIC-based, although they're developing application-specific integrated circuits that will be able to, that do today mine Ethereum as well. Is proof of work the end-all, be-all? Not necessarily. So it's the system that's worked for 10 years with Bitcoin. It's an amazing proof of concept. Ripple uses what I like to call, I haven't heard people at Ripple calling it this or at XRP. I like to call it a social consensus mechanism, where people who run the actual nodes that use the network choose their set of validators. That's still open in my mind because everyone who runs an individual node can choose which validators they want to trust, and it becomes sort of an open democracy, if you will, for validation. Interesting, different consensus mechanism with different trust assumptions built in. Proof of stake is another perceived solution to mining centralization. This idea that instead of asking to participate in the creation of blocks, instead of asking people to burn electricity and to solve this hashing function, we'll simply say, prove to us the rest of the network, that not that you've solved a math equation, but that you have a certain amount of the cryptocurrency traveling on the blockchain. Prove to us that you have a stake. And this isn't a monolithic technological construction either. There are bad ways to build that from a crypto economic standpoint. There might be good ways to build that, although they're all in the early testing stages. You can do all kinds of things when money is programmable, cryptocurrency. You can say, all right, the only people who are going to be able to participate in the block making and the ledger keeping and be eligible for the reward incumbent upon that activity are people who have a stake, or maybe people who have a stake and put it on the line such that it could be sacrificed, such that if there's proof of malfeasance, that money is destroyed. It's a proof of burn or a bonded proof of stake concept. So Ethereum's probably the network chugging along with the most value in it, at least, that is scheduled, at least, to undergo a massive shift in how the consensus works, from proof of work to their Casper project, which is their proof of stake project. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with respect to that in the next 2 years, because it's going to be a large shift, and we'll have different trust assumptions with decentralization. We'll have different assumptions with respect to scalability. It's worth watching. Real quickly, some other things about decentralization that are worth noting and connect to some of the other panelists here. So even in a normal proof of work blockchain, that power to choose which transactions to put into the block is a real power. Now, there are different ways to remove some of that power or shift it again. The Lightning Network, for example, is a scaling solution, usually, first. That's what it's usually considered. It's a way to get a lot more transactions into a block by doing what I think of as a kind of automated batch settlement. So instead of relying on a trusted party to do the batch settlement, you enter into these smart contracts where you lock some funds together and then you clear the channel one direction or the other. You could have thousands of transactions between each other with signed transaction messages, but then you only settle to the blockchain when you two are done with your channel. Now, what's great about that is you could have thousands of transactions and only one transaction settled to the blockchain. And this could work through networks so that someone who's a major node within the Lightning Network settles only occasionally, and millions of transactions might be running through them. Now, that means that the miner, when they choose to put that transaction into the blockchain, has no idea what the millions of transactions settled by that transaction were. And they don't have the power to unilaterally block them or misdirect them and things like that. So Lightning, far from just being a scaling solution, also has real implications for decentralization. It is another check on the power of miners, just as software developers and users are also checks on miners. It's almost like we're adding in a fourth branch of government if we're thinking about checks and balances here. Of course, we're not destroying power. We're just spreading it out and shifting it around. And then the last thing I wanted to say was with respect to privacy. Josh works at the Zcash company. Full disclosure, I am an uncompensated board member at the Zcash Foundation, which is an unrelated entity that is nonetheless also working on the Zcash core protocol software and on the community. So what does privacy have to do with decentralization? Something quite fundamental. If you're using this highly advanced cryptography that Josh was talking about with respect to the new Zcash release, Sapling, if you're using ZK snarks or other cryptography to mask salient details of transactions from the larger public, such that people can have privacy when they transact on these networks, and by the way, also potentially retain information that could be subpoenaed by law enforcement. So these aren't just tools for criminals. These are tools for personal privacy when it's warranted, and then disclosure of personal information when it's warranted, i.e. with a warrant. Anyway, if you're using these types of transactions, in Zcash they're called shielded transactions, in Monero they're just the general flavor transaction, and there's several other networks, your miner, aside from others in public, will not necessarily know who's transacting with how much money. So again, the miner is then doing something much more rote and algorithmic. They are validating a zero-knowledge proof, or they are validating a ring signature in Monero. They don't know anything about what's going on in there. They're just performing a function that is the minimum necessary to guarantee the network's basic trust assumption. They're proving, in the case of zero knowledge proofs with Zcash, that this was a transaction that happened that didn't counterfeit any Zcash. It didn't increase or decrease. It didn't increase the supply of Zcash and inflate the currency. They don't prove or learn anything else about the transaction, like who made it and how much and between which parties. So it, again, takes power away from the miners. What they're doing is something so rote and algorithmic that their discretion is effectively destroyed. Is this a silver bullet? Absolutely not. But these are things I think a lot of people don't think about. They think Zcash is just a privacy tool. The Lightning Network is just a scalability tool. Consensus mechanisms are something you discuss in a weird, dorky room in MIT. All of these are really vibrant and rich topics, and there's a lot to discuss as far as how things have changed over the last 2 years and what's coming. And a lot of them relate to how we shift power around in these networks, not out of a desire to remove ourselves from regulation, more often than fact, but actually out of a desire to eliminate the need for it. If you have large trusted parties, you need strong regulations. If you have fewer or more and less powerful parties, you probably still need regulation. We still regulate the internet, but we regulate in a very different way than we regulated the 4 major television broadcasters back in the 1950s. So anyway.
Actually, thank you very much for that, Peter. Your last point, I think, is an excellent segue into our next question, which I'll pose to Ryan. Ryan, you've been doing a lot of work in the cross-border payment space, including working closely with regulators and regulations around the world and helping develop the market for cross-border payments using crypto assets. So, from your perspective, how is the crypto asset market for cross-border payments evolving? But more particularly, what is the role that regulation and regulators are playing in this development? Are they helping? Are they hindering? And what more can be done in this space?
Yeah, thank you. I don't agree, and I don't agree with Peter's comments here that the effort of this whole sector is to eliminate regulation or make there not be a need for regulation.
I just suggested minimizing it. As I said, we still regulate the internet. We just regulate it differently than the big 4 television stations that came in the 1950s.
Okay. From an institutional perspective, regulatory certainty is a prerequisite for adoption. And as we've talked about today and in several other panels, there is a shift into the institutional sector. So regulation becomes critical there. It's regulatory clarity becomes critical there. What we're seeing internationally, so we have 100 clients covering a majority of the current highly traded currencies in the world today. These are real transactions that are happening. We're seeing a recognition globally that blockchain and crypto will play a critical role in future infrastructure for payments. How? It's still uncertain. But that it will play a role has become pretty clear. So there's become a race to provide that regulatory certainty to give countries a leg up. I sense there's a recognition that the future of finance is not guaranteed to be in the US anymore, but rather there is a global race to take that crown. You're seeing it in countries like Singapore. You're seeing it in the UK, which just last week laid out a multi-pronged effort to provide regulatory clarity for blockchain and crypto. You're seeing it in countries like Abu Dhabi and Thailand, who have created holistic frameworks for crypto to provide guidance on market activity, internal controls at companies, the type of licensing and risk management that needs to take place for institutional adoption. And some of these places, Abu Dhabi is leaning in because they want to be a leader in the Middle East. Thailand initially started from a place of concern about consumer protection, but moved to a place of recognizing there's potential. We need to have that balance between risk and innovation. Where we're at so there is a global race. You see it on payment infrastructure. For a long time, the US dollar has been the global reserve, and the US has been a primary player in that payment infrastructure. I think now that people are competing. And we heard a second ago from was it Josh about the early days of the internet. Countries are competing using the same play from our playbook. Like the US won the internet race. We won it by putting forth holistic policy that covered electronic commerce and gave US companies the leg up. Like that framework became globally adopted and it's still used today. So that leadership in the US led us and gave us a competitive advantage so that the major internet companies globally are US based. That was a key win that was policy driven. And these other countries are taking that same approach now. A holistic government framework that's multi-pronged, it's multi-regulator, that's creating that regulatory certainty.
I guess, Ryan, sometimes we fear a race to the bottom, but what you're describing is actually a race to the top.
It's a race to holistic, clear, strong regulation that protects markets, ensures market integrity and consumer protection, but also balances innovation. If it's really weak regulation, no one's going to go there because the company nor consumers are protected.
I mean, weak, strong, these are sort of vague terms with respect to, I think what we want is reasonably calibrated to suit the ills that these networks create or don't create where they don't create them. So one good example is there's still lots of people who are holding their Bitcoins or their XRP or their Ethereum with centralized parties, custodial wallet providers, for example. Now, Coin Center has written several reports on how we deal with the risks inherent in letting someone custody other people's digital assets. What's a good way to address that? Well, they should be regulated parties. If you walk like a bank and you quack like a bank, you're a duck bank, you know? Or not necessarily banking in this case, but really something more simple like being a trust or being a money transmitter if you're holding people's cryptocurrency. So we can have reasonably calibrated regulations around that activity. You're holding other people's Bitcoin. You should get a license from the 53 states and territories that license that activity. Now, I see the US as having a problem here, not so much because, well, I think I do agree with Ryan, because we don't necessarily take a holistic approach all the time. Now that's not for lack of trying. We have some structural issues here in the US that make it very difficult to take a holistic approach. So, Ross, you're smiling, but having been here in DC at the IMF, you must, and having a global perspective, you must think, gosh, this is a place where we have 9 financial regulators at the federal level and 53 states and territories. So much easier in so many European or other countries around the world.
Well,
where you have a single
remember,
financial
Peter, I'm a
regulator.
Canadian, and we have a federal system too, and I think we could match you agency for agency.
We'll fight for bureaucratic red tape. So why should money transmission regulation, full stop, if it's PayPal or Venmo, let alone if it's regulating custodians like Coinbase or Zappo, be a state-by-state affair here in the US? Okay, fix it. Okay, we need a federal regulator for that activity. Okay, which one? Pick one, and then they might actually fight over that territory to a certain extent, and it's not clear which regulatory authority has the relevant competencies here. So it's a difficult struggle, but it's the right struggle. Now, the other thing I just wanted to point out quickly is that the Clinton administration's framework for the global information infrastructure, which was sort of the unifying policy of America towards the internet in the 1990s, and I think absolutely did help make the US a leader in those technologies, something that we're potentially lacking today, was not just a holistic approach, it was a light touch approach. I mean, again, weak versus strong, who knows? But it was let the private sector lead, use the common law where necessary, wherever possible to address harms and things like that. And I think that's the approach we really want with respect to cryptocurrencies. So this is why the securities law question is very important to me, because the SEC is very much, and for the right reasons, a top-down regulator. is because an issuer has massive information asymmetries that should be addressed through good things like disclosure that is mandated from a strong regulator like the SEC. And there are plenty of projects in our space that need the same strong top-down regulation in order to protect investors, I think. But there are also projects that I believe, in good faith, are decentralized, wherein those information asymmetries fall away. And if we were to impose a securities regulatory framework on top of those, we'd be crushing them. And it would be very much an anathema to the light touch approach that the Clinton administration took with respect to the open internet in the 1990s. So striking that balance is very hard, especially when there's so much on the line. There's innovation, and there's also the potential for grave investor harms when these things are used for fraud.
Excellent, thank you. Desiree, maybe I can ask you a question now, maybe drilling down a little bit more on the scalability issue, which I think we all agree is a very important element in expanding the use of crypto assets. But I'd like to ask you this question, maybe from a financial inclusion angle. How do you think that solving scalability will promote the use of crypto assets in developing countries? And more generally, for use by small and medium-term enterprises, wherever they may be located?
Right, yeah, so in a former role, when I was Blockchain and Digital Currency Fellow at Women for Women International, we worked a lot with communities, not just women, but of men and women who lived in post-conflict marginalized areas that were often underbanked and more frequently completely unbanked. So I think solving the scalability piece, making these transactions cheaper, making them faster, and in a lot of cases making them private for certain reasons, really opens up not just financial inclusion, but financial empowerment. And we think about things like lndwork.com, which is basically a website where people list small tasks or jobs, and people complete them and in return receive Bitcoin via Lightning payments. And that has been like an incredible success so far for something that's so new and so infantile. So opening up, giving people the potential. I mean, these people often have access to internet but no bank, and so giving them the access to cryptocurrency opens up the possibility to participate in a global marketplace, which is incredibly powerful. And we found a lot of these individuals who can't sell their goods in their communities or outside near their communities, that they could actually do so in a global marketplace, through different resources available via the internet. So I think that has a huge potential in some of those communities.
Excellent. Thank you. I don't know if other colleagues here would like to add to that.
I mean, our core focus is on remittances, and doing it at a fraction of the cost today. So we're seeing that work directly in line with where we're at. Thailand to Japan was our first, or Japan to Thailand was our first remittance corridor. We've seen volumes double month over month since that's gone live later last year. We're just seeing rapid growth there. And one of our key partners, Santander, has a global remittance service built and underpinned by Ripple that does real-time remittances between 5 currencies today, expanding out over next year as well. So we're seeing a key focus on how the technology can enable financial inclusion, which we see as a core positive here.
I think to add on that, you also see, some of these South American exchanges, people are already using Bitcoin for store of value and, actually transacting in places like Venezuela. And so solving the scalability piece just further enables those people to use this great innovation to have some type of livelihood. And, the further that this scales, the faster it is, the easier it is for these individuals to use. More people are just going to start using it. So some of these places, I think it can be a complete game changer. And then I think when you start thinking about censorship and you get into the privacy piece, which is I'm not an expert at, that just becomes a really interesting facet to the whole thing.
Thank you very much, Desiree. Maybe turning to Josh now. Zcash has brought to the forefront the issues of privacy and transparency and security. And the desire that users have for privacy many cases for legitimate reasons, but perhaps in a few cases for less legitimate reasons. So I'd like to ask you, in facilitating the wide-scale adoption of the crypto assets, do we need to draw a balance between privacy and security on the one hand versus transparency on the other, in circumstances, for example, where regulators may wish to know, what's going on with particular transactions? And if so, how do you do that? How do you draw the balance?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple points in there. One, I think in some places the balance has already been drawn. So for those not familiar, NYDFS, New York Department of Financial Services, this year approved Gemini, one of the major exchanges, to be able to list Zcash. And in NYDFS's press release started or gave a summary of why privacy was important, why it was an important fundamental right. So I think as regulators get more and more educated, I think we'll see more of that kind of thing, although there still is that fear, right? It's the classic narrative of if criminals get a hold of this, and they do, they're going to use it for drug trafficking, and they're going to use it for funding terrorism, or they're going to use it for laundering money. The reality is, if we go back to that internet analogy, back in the 80s, a technology came out called PGP, pretty good privacy, to allow for encryption of data over the web. And the NSA came out and they said this is no good because it's going to be used by terrorists and drug dealers and other people, and it's not something that we can control. And so they actually, I think there was a lawsuit even of somebody that was trying to distribute PGP. So we fast forward into the 90s. There was a recognition that in order to do commerce on the web and protect the safety of individuals doing commerce on the web, that we needed to have some level of security. So that same encryption was then used by Netscape, one of the early browsers, and something called SSL, to allow for financial encryption over the web. Fast forward to today, the US government mandates that all of its sites use that same technology that they had wanted to ban just earlier. So the NSA, you go there, it's HTTPS, right? They're encrypting the information and the data for folks. So likewise, we have this kind of dialogue today where we talk about, with most cryptocurrencies, everything's transparent. And we have the heuristical tools, and we have the sophistication to determine who those people are and how much money is being transmitted and how much money that they have. We believe that actually, rather than regulators tolerating privacy, that regulators ought to embrace privacy. So you have these third-party intermediaries like Gemini, and we have people transmitting money in and out of those exchanges. And if Gemini is KYC AML compliant, along with kind of these regulatory controls that need to be there in order to be able to support this. Right now, if I transfer money, the US government can see it, foreign governments can see it, bad actors can see it. Everybody can see that information, and that puts the safety of the individuals using that at risk, we believe. So instead, we actually believe that regulators ought to mandate that those transactions be encrypted, because in complying with KYC AML, the government can have access to information through those exchanges, but foreign governments can't see that information and use that information to manipulate citizens. And bad actors can't do that, putting the safety of people at risk. So we actually think this narrative ought to flip, and we do think that this will move from kind of fear to acceptance to allowance to mandating at some point, in the same way that we've moved in terms of encryption to HTTPS today. But just to make it personal, if you think about what that means, right? So if I asked you to take out your cell phone and open up your bank account, and I'm going to open up my cell phone, and I'm going to open up Twitter, and I'm going to ask you to read me your account information and all the transactions that you've had, right? Would you do it? What does that expose? And even if you're not fair, you're saying, well, we live in this a country where it's not so bad and we want to give up some privacy. But there's other information that also leaks. It's not just the transaction amount, and it's not just the account information. If you're transacting with somebody in person, that may disclose where you are. It has a timestamp. It may disclose what time you're there. It may disclose these patterns, and then it puts you at risk. So again, just really believe that it's actually in the best interest of the safety of citizens, certainly in the US, but worldwide, to, again, not only embrace privacy, but really to mandate it with some of these frameworks.
And as Josh was saying, exchanges that are now trading privacy-protecting cryptocurrencies, the vast majority of them, especially if they're here in the US, are Bank Secrecy Act regulated institutions. And I think that's surprising to a lot of lawyers in this space. They think, well, gosh, a BSA regulated institution can't deal in Zcash or Monero. It's simply not true. They can and they do. The obligations of a Bank Secrecy Act regulated institution are to know their customer. There aren't any black letter law requirements that says you can't deal in assets that don't have a full public registry, because such a requirement would be categorically absurd, because banks don't have a full public registry of where all the assets are. And banks for centuries have dealt in paper notes, in cash, which are far more anonymous even than Zcash. Despite the best efforts of cryptographers, there's still a blockchain that may have some data in there that could be mined to understand transactions. With cash, you'll need a camera on every street corner and clairvoyant knowledge of everyone's back pocket or wherever they keep their wallet to know the distributions. But banks have dealt with cash for centuries. One interesting potential area for where there could be some imbalance or where there could be some policy making done here is banks, with respect to cash transactions, have to file currency transaction reports, CTRs, for any transaction over $10,000. At the moment, there's no digital CTR requirement. So these BSA-regulated exchanges, they have to file SARs, but they don't necessarily have to file CTRs when someone takes out $10,000 worth of Bitcoin from their account. Maybe a digital CTR makes sense in order to just have parity with cash. But parity is what we're really seeking. We're not necessarily looking for an anarchist revolution here. We're just looking for a sensible, light touch application of existing rules to these fantastic new technologies, hopefully for the benefit of human dignity and privacy.
Peter, drilling down on policy a little bit more, from your perspective, for the industry to develop into a really mature marketplace with, a wide range of service providers, offerings, and products, what role do you think policymakers should be playing now? Sort of what's missing that you would recommend?
I don't think there's that much missing. It's just not always satisfying to the community how these things necessarily have to unfold. So I think one of the biggest and best developments in the law and regulation of cryptocurrencies over the last year has been the incredibly careful and well-reasoned approach to securities regulation taken by the SEC. Now, some crypto advocates out there might think that I have four heads when I say that, because they think, oh, the Howey test is too amorphous. I don't understand it. I just want to sell my token, and it's not a security, and it's complicated, and why can't they just give me a black letter standard that says this, this, and this? Well, black letter standards don't make any sense with respect to complicated new technologies. You set the black letter standard here, and the technology was here, and then 2 years later the technology is over here, and this black letter standard is even more incomprehensible than anything that a flexible standard could have produced. So while it's uncomfortable, this process of running an analysis of Bitcoin through the Howey test and the Gary Plastic and associated case law, it's the right approach. We have these great old doctrines, some of them from 70 years ago, dealing with orange cases, that actually they get at the heart of policy matters. Asymmetric information, disclosure would address that. Is there asymmetric information? Is there reliance on somebody who has that asymmetric information? You can run that through with Bitcoin. You can run that through with Ethereum. And the process is going to be messy in a kind of common law way, but it's an advantage, I think, in a country like the US where we have these common law type legal reasoning mechanisms in place. And I think that's what has to happen. It's not going to lead to the clear results immediately that a lot of people in the technology space might want, but it'll lead to the right results and if applied gently and with compassion, which I think, again, I think the SEC has actually done over the last year, it's the regime that we want.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, so I'd like to invite you now to come up. There are microphones here. May we ask you to identify yourself before you state your question?
Sure. My name is Jim Angel from Georgetown University. The proof of work required from Bitcoin 1.0, if you look at the current hash rate, is over 5,000 megawatts. That's the equivalent of 5 Chernobyls running 24/7. Bitcoin 1.0 is an environmental catastrophe that runs 7 transactions per second. What can be done to scale the system, not Bitcoin 1.0, but cryptos in general, to move away from this environmental catastrophe?
So I strongly disagree that it's an environmental catastrophe.
5 Chernobyls.
There's 50. Well, first of all, Chernobyl blew up and destroyed land in Eastern Europe because of radioactivity. People running normal nuclear or normal power plants that don't blow up are what we're talking about here.
Carbon dioxide pollution.
So right, CO2
Global
is an
warming.
issue. Aluminum smelting consumes a massive amount of electricity, something on the order of I believe 8 to 9% of the total global electrical usage is aluminum smelting. Now, your Mac unibody construction, is it worth that? I don't know. And you might say Bitcoin's just not worth it. Now, that's fine. If you just don't think Bitcoin's worth the electricity because you don't like Bitcoin or because you don't recognize it as a real technological innovation, that's a discussion. But the mere fact that it consumes electricity isn't necessarily automatically an environmental catastrophe. And the bottom line is, if we're going to have a single source of truth, a public ledger that anybody can access and write to in order to declare something with trust built in, then that should be something that has weight behind it. Now, there are lots of interesting questions here. What could the weight be? Could the weight be who you choose as your validators in the case of Ripple's consensus mechanism and how the globe decides to choose their validators? Is that the right weight? Is it something that we're trust? The weight might need to be electricity, burnt. The weight might need, as in Bitcoin, the weight might need to be proof of stake, which is people actually putting their cryptocurrency on the line and provably sacrificing that in a similar way to how they provably sacrifice electricity. These are very complicated and hard questions, but condensing it down into this rhetoric of catastrophe is not, I don't think, a suitable way to find the answers. And it does run the risk of having a sort of Luddite quality where we say, this is just garbage. We need to get rid of it. We need to do something about it. I just
we
worry
need
about the
to
heightened
move
rhetoric.
beyond proof of work. So
I don't know.
Maybe
not. Maybe with the current proof of work, you could have millions of transactions, and 5 nuclear power plants could power millions of transactions because they're batch settled using the Lightning Network to the same proof of work Bitcoin blockchain. That is a scaling solution that has real chops, real, I think, possibilities of success, we'll see, and would still involve a fair amount of electricity consumption, but it wouldn't scale linearly. It would scale vastly sublinearly with use of the network. So you could have perhaps millions of transactions with the same amount of electricity used today. Right. You might still use proof of work.
Great. I'm going to invite Ryan and Desiree. I don't know if you would like to comment on this as well. But Ryan, go ahead.
Proof of work doesn't work. Proof of work doesn't work. It's been widely...
Ryan, proof of work's been working.
Let me finish. Proof of work doesn't work.
Let him finish, please.
And in the early days of Bitcoin, there was a whole group of developers that broke off to create other assets, XRP being one of them, that doesn't use mining, that's cheaper from an energy perspective than Visa, and already scales to 1,500 transactions a second. A lot of these problems have already been solved. The challenge for adoption comes back to policy. The policy uncertainty around some of the assets has limited adoption, particularly here in the US. And I'm speaking from Ripple and XRP because we use that asset because it's a half a cent per payment. It's basically free. It scales and it's efficient. It's 1,500 transactions a second at nearly no energy burn. So we're at a point today where there are real solutions to all of these challenges that already exist. Policy has become the challenge. And we heard on the first panel that around centralization on China, and this is going to be a hard pill for Peter to swallow. But 80% of the mining power for Bitcoin is controlled by 6 mining pools, 5 of which are in China. Today, the policy certainty in the US exists for Bitcoin and Ethereum, despite the fact those are China-controlled platforms. So activity goes to those platforms. What we need to do from a policy perspective in the US is look at the places where there are uncertainty. And one place, I'm speaking directly for me here, is XRP, where it looks like Bitcoin. It's decentralized, it's open source. We have 7% of the validation power on that, rather small in there. Grouping or giving clarity to those ones that are very similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum, that have the same characteristics and should be classified the same way. And then we're creating a level playing field across all the cryptos. I'm not anti-Bitcoin or anti-Ethereum by any means. I think there's a lot of great potential and breakthrough there. But we need to have a level playing field so the market can pick which ones they want to use and not be, as today they are, hindered by regulatory uncertainty.
And to be clear, I agree with Ryan that we need more regulatory clarity about more cryptocurrencies. And to my knowledge, the way XRP and its network are constructed seems to fit the bill from a decentralization standpoint. So clarity is important, but there are trust assumptions in any consensus mechanism. Proof of work-based consensus mechanism, proof of stake-based, a social consensus model, as I think of Ripple's, and they're all unknowns right now. So to say that we definitely have the solution and we definitely don't need proof of work, I think is a dangerous exaggeration. There could be liabilities in these other mechanisms, just as there are liabilities in proof of work.
We have time for one quick question. We have 1 minute left to go before we finish. Any further questions? Great, then please join me in thanking our panelists, Ryan, Desiree, Josh, and Peter. It was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
So we'll just take a 15-minute break and then head into our next session.